Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about our consent forms. So we are going to talk you through our forms, the forms that we completed just one by one, and we do have some notes in front of us, and we will describe each form that we completed and any kind of questions or topics that arose for us. We're not sure kind of how this differs across the UK, but as we've said previously, we're based in Scotland, and we completed these forms with our clinic to make sure that everything was legal before we started our treatment.
So with the consent appointment, we actually had that around about 6 weeks ago now. It was kind of the first step once we'd made the decision to go ahead with the journey. We meant to film it at the time, we forgot, we've got all of our notes written down. So what we wanted to do is just take a minute to go back and kind of go back through our notes with you, talk about what that appointment was and all the forms that we had to fill in, just to give that overview as well.
I think when we initially were coming to our consent appointment, we didn't really understand what it was about. Again, because we did our clinic has a checklist. I think I've said this. The first thing is your assessment, then your consultation, then your consent appointment. And we did our assessments and our consultation a year ago now. And in October, we went back to the clinic, said we were ready to get started, so they put us straight in for a consent appointment. So we thought we would make this video to discuss some of the types of questions and forms and things that came up to hopefully give you some information about what that was like and some of the decisions that we made.
Yeah.
So the first form that we want to talk about is the consent to disclose information form. So this is a form that asks us questions about who we're happy to share our information with. So for example, are we willing to share our information with our GP? Are we willing to share with our wider medical teams, such as hospitals and health visitors and things in the future? And also if we're willing to share our information for the purpose of research. So I suppose the main kind of questions that came up, we were totally happy to share information with our GP. Our GP is already aware that we are starting this process and is really, really supportive. So we're really lucky. Equally with medical teams, we want, whoever needs to know can know. Absolutely. We're not kind of funny about that at all. The main talking point for us would have been about research. So there was kind of initially when we had read the consent forms before we had the consent appointment, we had been like, yeah, absolutely, we're happy to consent to be involved in any research. So it gives the example of, in the future, can we contact you if you fit the population that we're looking to study? So we were imagining, in the future that if they were doing a study on same-sex couples or, their outcomes or things like that, we would be quite happy to take part. When we had our consent appointment, we discussed this with our nurse, and she explained that we also need to think about how we are also consenting for our child to be, I was going to say used in medical research, that's not right, contacted in the case of kind of fitting the right population. And we weren't really sure about that, just because, again, it feels funny to consent for somebody who actually doesn't exist yet. There's two types of research that they ask you to consent for, or if you wish to consent for. One is non-contact research. So they won't actually contact us, but just that the information they already have in the system could be used in their further research. And then the other one is contact research. That's where they would get in touch with us about kind of long-term outcomes, I guess. That'd be right.
And I guess maybe updates or progress, in health and well-being, I guess. Yeah, so as I said, we were happy to do that for ourselves. We had a discussion about whether we were happy to do it for our child, and what we have agreed is that we would sign those forms on the basis of the fact that consent can be withdrawn at any time. So if they do contact us and we think actually we're not happy with this, or it's not something we want to do, or it's not the right time, or it's not for our child, or we can then say no. So all we're really consenting to right now is somebody can contact us.
Yeah, if
and
we fit the bill.
Then we can make a decision on whether we want to proceed with that.
Yeah.
So that feels fair and balanced.
Yeah, and I suppose
the second kind of piece on consent was a separate form, wasn't it, about the consent to share information between each other, which seemed like an odd question, if I'm honest, given that we're going in it as a couple.
Yeah.
But they needed, a legal form signed to say that the clinic can talk to Jess about me and my results, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Just so that they were covered for that. So obviously there was no complications or issues on that one.
Yeah, which was already really helpful because they have phoned us, and if they can't get one of us, they'll just phone the other one. So that's really helpful, particularly because where I work, I don't have good phone signal. Yeah. So if they do try and phone me, I often won't be able to answer the phone. So it's quite handy that Sheila's available to answer the phone. They call us donors, recipients, and intended parents. So donor, recipient, intended parents. Yes. So obviously that's in the case of if I was donating to somebody else, then they would be able to know about my results and things like that if I was, doing tests and things. But obviously with it just being us, we're just sharing information between each other. So the third form that we completed was the welfare of the child form. There was a number of forms, we can't remember which one was which, but there was a number of forms from the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. You can see me looking down at my notes. The HFEA. They are I think they're like a government organisation that makes sure that these treatments stay kind of ethical and legal, and that they keep the prospective child at the centre of what they're doing. So that's why I remember that the welfare of the child forum was from them. And essentially that just asks us questions about our history. It asks us about our mental health, our physical health, questions about kind of violence in the past, our relationship, do we feel safe, those kind of questions. And it's also
kind of hit on like drink and drugs, addictions and history and things like that as well. When we were in our consents appointment and had that conversation, it's really just so the clinic can say that they're happy that there's no issues that could impact the welfare of a child. Yeah. It also does say on the form, if you answer yes to any of these questions, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't let you go ahead. They talk about next steps and supporting you through the process to make sure that I guess just that you're in a good environment to bring a child into it. I guess what I find strange about it is that they were just relying on us responding. Yeah. It wasn't like, well, we're going to speak to your GP or we're going to do a little bit of checks. So I wonder about that a little bit, in terms of the honesty within that. I don't know, which was a question that popped through my mind. I don't really know the answer to it, I guess. But it does also have, I can't remember exactly, because we don't have the forms now that we've completed them and obviously sent them back, but it had a box in it for comments from the nurse. So the nurse can answer in that box, if they have any concerns about us as a couple or anything's been kind of raised. And then it does say again, if this is the case, we will have a discussion with you about next steps, etc. Although it was a tick-a-box exercise, or it felt potentially a little bit like a tick-a-box exercise, it's still good that it's done. And there's still that opportunity for somebody to raise a concern or to discuss any issues they're worried about personally or that the clinic are worried about. So it is definitely good that it was done. I just wonder about it a little bit. Yeah. So the fourth form that we completed was genetic testing in the case of a known donation. So obviously we are a known donor because we know who I am and I am donating to Sheila. Yeah. So there was a couple of forms that were specific to me being the known donor, and there was a couple of forms that were specific to Sheila being the known recipient. And generally when you would do a donation, if you're an egg donor, you would go through a series of genetic tests to ensure that you're not passing on any conditions, hereditary conditions to prospective children. Very much like a sperm donor. Yeah. That whole same that process that they go through. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that when you're a known donor, you can sidestep that and say, actually, we're happy that we know our own history, that I'm not willingly or knowingly passing on any genetic conditions. It does actually say, if you know that you have any genetic conditions and you do not state them now, that the child can essentially sue you in the future, which is a bit mental. I was on the phone to my mum, do we have any conditions that we need to say? But we don't. So how far back in the family history? Yeah. So we don't. I don't have anything like that in my family that I'm aware of. So I was
we were pretty comfortable to say that we didn't want that. We did hum and haw about it, because initially I was very much pro like testing. I wanted everything to kind of be known. I think it's such an unknown process that any information that you can know, you want to know.
Yeah.
However, the genetic testing was A, expensive, B, probably unnecessary. Like the nurse, I don't want to say she talked us out of it, because she was very clear that she was not allowed to influence us in any way.
No.
But she probably did a little bit talk us out of it.
She did kind of say, like in her view, like because we know each other, because we know the family history, that the benefits of genetic testing would be quite minimal for us.
Yeah.
So that we took that on board, I think.
Yeah, and it's like any other couple, right? Any other kind of heterosexual couple. You don't go and get genetic screening before you get pregnant. You just kind of know each other, and if there's any issues, you would highlight them. So we signed to sidestep that one.
Yeah.
And there was a couple of bits under that, I think. Yeah, so there was 2 parts to that. The first part was about chromosome analysis. So that's checking generally for issues. And then the second one's for cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is quite a common genetic condition that we can be carriers of in the UK. I can't remember the exact stats, but I will put them into this video. And even more specifically for people in Ireland, I think it's higher again. So obviously being Irish, there's a possibility that I could be a carrier of cystic fibrosis and it just not be an expressed gene. I don't have any cystic fibrosis in my family for lots and lots of generations, so it's probably unlikely, but it's definitely not completely ruled out. However, what we did decide is that because our sperm donor is definitely not a carrier of cystic fibrosis, that even if I was a carrier, it just makes our child, I think, 50% likely to be a carrier. Yeah. So they're not likely to have cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis becomes a problem when both parents are carriers, because then the chances of the child having cystic fibrosis are quite high.
The genes become more dominant.
Yeah. So because I'm pretty unlikely to have it and the sperm donor definitely doesn't, we said no to chromosome analysis and no to cystic fibrosis. The other things that wanted to check for, one was my blood group, but they already have that, or I have that, so somehow we didn't need to test for that because I know what I am. Yeah. And then the other one was CMV testing. So there's loads and loads of information about CMV testing, and I would say to you to go and do your research before you sign your consent. It depends on what you watch and who you talk to and what you read. We initially thought it was really, really important that we find out about whether I'm CMV positive or negative.
It's one of the things that threw us, wasn't it? Because we thought we needed to know that before we could find a sperm donor.
Yeah, because if your sperm and your egg go together and one is and one isn't, there was questions about that. But then also CMV testing in relation to Sheila, because I think if the baby is CMV positive and she's negative, so we were like, who gets CMV test? It was all a big mess. Our clinic really was like, it does not matter. Yeah. The evidence on it is not clear. Many people have babies all over the world every day and don't know if they're CMV positive or negative. They were really, really clear to us that it was not an issue unless it was important to us. So that there's quite a lot to declining genetic testing, and I think if you are in the case of egg donation, that's obviously where this is important. Yeah. And if you're a known donor, you can bypass it, so we have. So the next form that I had to complete, so we had one each, they were really similar, and mine was the consent to donating eggs, and yours was
Mine was the agreement for the receipt of donated eggs by a known donor.
Oh yeah, so mine was consent to donating eggs to a known donor. Recipient. Which is essentially what it says on the tin. Like, I was just saying, like, I consent to give my eggs to Sheila. Yeah. And it makes you say, like, I, Jessica, blah, 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 donate to Sheila, blah, blah, blah.
And it's worth pointing out on these forms, although there was one for Jess and there was one for me, on all of them at the bottom, we both had to sign each other's again.
So it comes back to what we said earlier, this thing about
being a donor, a recipient, and a
intended parents.
Yeah, that's the word.
So we often were signing forms as multiple people. So I was signing that I'm happy to donate my eggs as the donor to the intended parents, and I was signing that part as well. So I was donating my egg to myself and Sheila as the intended parents. So there was like times where I was both the intended parent and the donor, and Sheila was the recipient and the intended parent. So yeah,
it kind of got a bit confusing, but effectively it covered all the bases then. So we're both on everything, the end was everything, and that should help.
Yeah, I think it's also important to say that like they really guided us through this. So when you get the paperwork, it's like a pack like this, and it's really like we were reading it like, what does all this mean? Because it's all lots of legal jargon. Some of it is complicated, some of it's really straightforward. But it does bring up lots of questions, and we did sit down and go through it all together. But it says like on every letter and every note we got was like, do not sign anything until your appointment, because they really do talk you through each form like one at a time and explain exactly what you are signing up to. And they keep asking you, do you understand the information we're giving you, and are you sure, and do you need more time to sign it? And so they were really like helpful in guiding us through the process, and we didn't, you know, by the end of the consent appointment we knew exactly what we had signed up to. And I think, was there only one form we hadn't signed by the end of the appointment? Was that our genetic screening?
Yeah, we just wanted to have a double think about the CMV piece, really, didn't we?
Yes.
And make that decision before we could then send them back.
Yeah, that was the only one we didn't sign during the appointment, just because again, if we've any doubt whatsoever, well, certainly our nurse was like, okay, just have some time to think about it. Like,
so the biggest thing on that form, and it was quite an obvious one, was just about how many families you're willing to donate to.
Yes, yeah, you're right. So yeah, it was funny. It was really a weird question, and so that was the difference between when we got the pack versus when we did the appointment. Because when you get the pack and you're reading the forms, and it literally says like, I, the donor, I'm happy to donate to, and then there's like a box, and then it's many families. So you have to put in a number, and I was just like, one family, like my own family. But I don't know, like at the time we were like, that's a weird question, like is there a chance that my eggs could go somewhere else? So there was lots of kind of weird bits around that.
And the kind of reciprocal of that on my form was how many embryos I was willing to have implanted at one go. That was on that form. So I had to specify 1 or 2 or however many.
So again, our clinic led us on that. And by saying that really they only will transfer 1 embryo, but they ask us to sign to say that we're happy to donate one or two based on the information we've been given, because in some cases they will implant 2. But it's very rare. But she said at least if we are happy to sign that we are assuming we will do 1, but we will do 2 in special circumstances. Yeah, the other thing as well that came with my consent to donating eggs pack was like a whole donor information pack. So a bit like if you've ever gone looking for egg donors or sperm donors, you will see that, you know, they have their profiles, they have all the information about themselves, their interests, their hobbies, like a letter to the child and things like that. So it asked me to fill all of that out, and I was quite reluctant to do that.
We were both a bit confused by that one, to be fair, but
so when we did our appointment at the clinic, they were like, no, you don't need to do any of that, it's not a problem. So that was fine.
Did you not end up writing like just like 2 words? You had to fill it in, but you didn't need to put a lot of detail in it because it was for a known recipient. But they did need enough form filled in officially to have on file effectively. Which was a bit odd, but...
So the next form that we filled in was the consent to being the legal parent, that was mine, or consent for partner to be the legal parent, which is Sheila's. So we both had pretty similar forms, but really, really, really important. So when we had done our research into this, we found out that, I suppose as a bit of a disclaimer, people get pregnant in lots of ways, and we don't have any judgment about kind of any ways of doing it. And what I would say to you is just be really careful about the legal side of things. Through going through the consent process, we've really learned a lot about the legal implications of doing insemination without a clinic, for example. So just make sure that you have all the information that you need if you are going down a route where you don't have support from a clinic. For example, we found out that if Sheila was to receive my donated egg and another man's donated sperm and put an embryo in, without this paperwork that we've signed, I would have no rights. Sheila would be the legal mother, and actually the sperm donor would be the legal father if there wasn't these processes in place. So, which also, by the way, is very, what's the
awful word? Discriminatory.
Yeah. Because like I'm donating the same as him, but yet he gets rights and I don't. But anyway, that's a whole side story that I've ranted about before. But with these forms, the reason we sign these consent forms is so that we can essentially then both be the legal parents of any children born from these embryos. It did bring up some kind of questions for us. The main one was who owns the embryos. I really don't like that term.
But legally
it is, like whose are they? So as it stands, I will donate my eggs, hopefully. They will be made into embryos, and Sheila will own the embryos. So until the child is born, I don't really have any rights over the embryos or anything like that, which obviously doesn't matter at the moment because the children will be born. I will be a named parent. I think the way it's going to be is that I will be named parent and Sheila will be named mother. We're not 100% sure about that, but that's what we think is going to happen. But what we did discuss was what would happen in the case of if something happened to Sheila. So for example, if she died at some point, what would happen to those embryos? And actually, when we had our consent appointment, we found out that they would potentially be destroyed because I don't own them. They're not actually anything to do with me. So even though they're my eggs and obviously my genetics, they wouldn't have anything to do with me. So what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, so in the future, so obviously our plan is at some point Jess will also get to carry. So the plan is that ideally there'll be embryos that are frozen that Jess will then be able to use. If something were to happen to me, she wouldn't be able to use them unless I've already donated them back to her. So we have asked the question of the clinic in you know, how do we do that? Like, how can we, there must be a form, there must be some paperwork, there must be some kind of document that we can say that the entitlement is there should I not be here.
Yeah.
And she did talk us through lots of scenarios about if we were to split in the future, you know, who's got legal rights to what, or who, like, we did talk about the fact that if Jess were to die and I were to use the embryos, that Jess would still be named as legal parent of those future children.
Yeah.
So we went through all of that, but there was no answer to the question of
if something happened
to me before they'd been donated back.
Yeah, before they were babies. Yeah, because once they're babies, I have a right to them. But when they're still embryos, yeah. So we don't actually have a clear-cut answer to that yet. Another thing that came up for us when we were talking about consent to being legal parents was that in the event of something happening to one of us, how would this affect sort of grandparents' rights and extended family? Because obviously genetics does come into it in terms of the embryos being genetically linked to me. If something happened to me and Sheila were to carry them on, it's really important for me to be the legal parent, not for me because I won't be here, and potentially not even for the child because they won't actually ever know me, but for my extended family then to have grandparents' rights and things like that as well. So we were thinking kind of widely about what it means, not like in the first instance for the child, then for us, then for grandparents, etc. So we were really like thinking about it broadly.
It's really complicated.
And it is complicated and it's messy and it's really horrible to talk about, like thinking about like, oh, what if you died and what if I died? But ultimately the only thing that would be worse than that is not talking about it and then something happening and then having to make those decisions on our, or not getting to make the decisions. That would be even worse.
So just that they'll be whatever the law says they are, and that'll be that.
Like if something happened to you and then I just couldn't use them, that was the end of it, and just because we'd never had that conversation. Like, so I think it's really worth sitting down and having the conversations. I know that our clinic also provides counselling services where they can support you to talk about some of these issues if that's something that is helpful to you. So the next form that we got, so this wasn't one that we had to consent to, but they were forms that came in the pack, and it was my plan and Sheila's plan for treatment.
I had 2 plans.
You did have 2 plans. Do you remember the difference in 2 plans?
No.
One was
longer and one was shorter.
One was short term, short IVF, and one was long IVF. So at the time when we got them, we weren't sure of what our plans were. We read the plans, to be honest, it really didn't make a lot of sense to us. No. It described what all the drugs did, so that was really helpful.
And that's been helpful even now You know,
we
so
often
this
go
was
back
6
to that.
weeks ago, so since we've had more appointments and more information, we've been looking back at that to go, oh, okay, that's what that is, and now I understand that. So it's been helpful to have retrospectively this year.
So then there was 2 final consent forms. One was the Zika virus and Ebola consent form, and the other was a COVID consent form. So the Zika virus and Ebola just asked us, were we in a number of exotic countries, which is kind of laughable given the current climate, especially...
the nurse was kind of embarrassed saying that you'd fill in this form.
Have you been in these exotic, beautiful countries? No, I've not been out of my town, but thanks for asking. And even more ironic because it was followed by the COVID consent form, like, have you been isolating? Are you at home? Do you have a cough? So they were easy forms to fill out, just the usual. It was an interesting process, to be honest, to go through, and definitely not one to be taken lightly, because you really want to make sure that you're covered legally. I think obviously we still don't ever know what might happen, and you can't plan for every single eventuality, but to really start talking about some of the options and some of the things that might go wrong, and agreeing on a consent like plan forward through that you want the way you want the decisions to be made, I guess.
And I think I'm really grateful that we took the time ahead of the appointment to really read the forms, not just like, oh, what have I got in here, but to read each form, to think about what was in it, what it meant, did we understand it, did we not understand it, what were our thoughts on it, did we have the same opinion on it, did we have different opinions, what was our agreed approach forward, because in the appointment itself, I wouldn't say we were rushed, but we certainly didn't have that time to have that conversation between ourselves.
So so I think we were really well prepared, and again, watching lots of videos like these, we had done lots of research, and we've seen other people talk about these kind of forms and what they all meant and the types of questions that came up. So we had kind of talked about a lot of it already. There wasn't too many surprises. I think the hardest stuff to think about is what would happen if something bad happened to each of us, and how you make sure your child ultimately is protected, that you are protected, and that your extended family are protected.
And that your embryos are protected.
Your embryos are protected.
Yeah.
So I think that's all on the consent forms. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the comments, and we will be happy to answer them if we can. We are not the experts. We've only done this one time. But we did actually enjoy the process of consent. We enjoyed the conversations that it started, and I hope that this was a helpful video for you. So we will see you in the next one. Bye.